Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your hosts, Chris Jennings and Dr. Mike Brasher.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining me today in studio is my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher. Mike, how are you?
I'm doing well, Chris. Good to see you.
Also joining us today in studio is Dr. Heath Hagy, waterfowl ecologist for the National Wildlife Refuge System for the Southeast. Heath, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
Hey, Mike, before we really get into the weeds here, I'm going to let you kind of provide an introduction to what we're going to talk about today and why. This is our season in review episode, but this is so in-depth. So I kind of want you to go ahead and really set the tone for what we're going to talk about here today.
Yeah, this is, I think I said this last year. One of the things that I've enjoyed most about doing the podcast is it gives me more of a reason nowadays to actually connect with people all across the country, all across the continent throughout the year to kind of get a feel, keep a finger on the pulse of what's going on with waterfowl populations, waterfowl habitats. And obviously at the end of the hunting season, that's like the big culmination, or the hunting season itself is sort of the culmination of everything that we look forward to in a given year as waterfowl hunters. And now at the end of it, it gives us an opportunity to reflect back, not just on the hunting season itself, but even things that preceded that, and do, I guess, our best at trying to encapsulate everything that went on, and then how it unfolded and how it may have influenced people's experiences in the field. We did this last year around this time. Dr. Tom Mormon was our guest on that episode. That episode was well received. That conversation and what we pulled together for that particular episode also, I guess, led to the development of a season in review report, a sort of a written document that we released, and it too was well received and people liked it. So we're going to be doing that again, where we look at big picture, I guess, environmental patterns that we saw over the course of the breeding season and then over the course of the fall and winter, and then do our best based on what we heard from people all across the country to describe how that influenced what happened with the birds, with the habitats, and with people's experiences there. Obviously, there's exceptions across the board. Every single year, some people are going to tell us that they had their best year ever hunting. Some will tell us that they had their worst year ever. That's the case again this year for sure. So that's kind of the nature of what we're going to do here, is just look back, season in review, and hopefully it answers some questions, gives some people things to think about in the context of how the full annual cycle of waterfowl plays out.
And that was a super long description for where were the ducks? That's right.
That's right.
Where
were the ducks?
Where were the ducks?
That's the question.
It's complicated.
Right. It is. And that's the thing. And that's what I as well enjoy about doing these podcasts and really talking through it. Platforms like the magazine and even the website, we are limited in some capacity to word count and discussions and who can we interview and who, with this, we can openly talk and listeners can kind of hear, what both of you were seeing, Heath, you from kind of a southeastern perspective, but you also hear and you work with people throughout the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service who are providing you information throughout the country, so
Absolutely.
You can provide that. But Mike, you're talking to people throughout the season and really trying to get a grasp of, and that's what it is. Like, where were the ducks? Why did they do this? Why did they do that? And I'll let you go ahead and start out with, we have information that you've pulled together as far as precipitation and things like that. But let's start out with when the season began. we were looking at this and talking about this in July and August, and everyone knew, especially from a science perspective, everyone knew that there was a drought in the prairies, U.S. and Canada. Canada was really even worse than the U.S. Let's start out with that, Mike, or even Heath, what were you guys looking at from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife kind of perspective? You were looking at this drought, and then, kind of taking that continental perspective of, what could this potentially mean? And then we'll just kind of go from there.
I'll start off, and Heath, you can offer your comments, your perspective as well. And you're right, Chris, that is where we have to start. We we try to remind people of that by being able to do this podcast year round. I think we're able to, just like the magazine, piece together the different parts of what happens in waterfowl's annual cycle. And when we think about what it is that we see in the fall and winter of a given year, we really have to go back and look at the way conditions unfolded the preceding spring and summer, that breeding season. And of course, that's the nature of the conversation around which we talked all about drought last year on the prairies. It was in Prairie Canada, it was really about the second or third consecutive year of dry conditions. In the States, it was incredibly dry last summer. But if you go back to, I guess it would have been the spring, summer of 2020, the Dakotas were actually pretty wet. But last year, spring, summer of 2021 was the first time in many years where we have had a very widespread drought. And as all of our conversations sort of bore out last year, people were expecting very low production to come out of the prairies. And when you think about the ducks that emerge from the prairies, for which that region is so important, we're talking about some of the most abundant duck species: dabbling ducks, mallards, pintails, shovelers, blue-winged teal, green-winged teal. I feel like I'm missing one of the gadwall. Did I not say? Yeah, gadwall, definitely. So there are a suite of species that are among the most abundant population size-wise that are so heavily tied to the prairies. When it dries up, those populations are going to dip. And although we didn't have survey data last year, we didn't have it the prior year either, I think every waterfowl biologist expected a pretty low fall flight last year. Now, the one thing that I'll mention here, I don't think we'll get into this in any detail, but it does affect the way people's perception of the hunting season, which is going to kind of unfold, is the fact that we were in a liberal harvest package this past year. We've talked about that, why that is, how that came to be on previous episodes, so we won't belabor that here. But it is important to kind of say that I think the fact that we were in a liberal season it provided in the minds of people a bit of a mismatch in what we were saying relative to the low productivity versus a liberal season, kind of sending the message of, oh, it should be a great season. But again, that's just a nuance in the way the harvest management is set right now. And so I think that mentally challenged some of us as hunters to think about and really calibrate what to expect. But yeah, it started with an expectation of low fall flight, maybe average production out of the boreal forest. And I will say, based on when we think about the prairies and the boreal forest, we kind of have to compartmentalize and think about those areas being really important for the eastern three flyways, central Mississippi and Atlantic. And of course, what happens in the Pacific is affected by some of those western breeding areas. What I observed and what I heard a lot of other people observing is consistent with low productivity out of those, at least out of the prairies. A lot of adult birds in the harvest. I saw that. I heard that. In some cases, birds were harder to decoy because they're going to be adult birds. I could tell stories of some of our staff, our chief scientists in the Dakotas, and I think maybe even some of our research partners, state partners up there, people that hunt a lot, saying there were some days when they hunted in the Dakotas where they didn't shoot a bird. That's rare, so that's one of those anecdotal observations of just what we think the fall flight was last year, probably pretty low. Heath, what perspectives do you have relative to any of that out of the prairies or anything out of other parts of the breeding areas?
Mike, I think you nailed it. One of the things that we as scientists sort of appreciate is the complexity in figuring out how many ducks we expect to come down here, right? Because everyone has their opinion about it, and there's a lot that happens in the time and the distance between the breeding areas and us down in the southeast and across the wintering areas of the southern U.S. and Mexico. And so it's just super complicated when you add the uncertainty of not having the survey data, not having the pond count data. It just makes our job even harder. And yeah, we worry about the same things. I mean, I would like to think that that I didn't kill that many ducks this year because there are a bunch of adults. So that's my excuse too. I don't know if that's in reality what really happened, but yeah, I had a tough hunting season too. It's super challenging under a normal year to sort of get it right and to predict all of the outcomes that may say, well, we're going to have a good year in this area of Arkansas or a good year here in North Carolina. At the end of the day, it was just really challenging this year because we had less data than we usually do.
And I think, it's important, like you mentioned, there's so many variables to this. And so it's hard when I have people ask me, which most time I just forward these emails to Mike. But, it's one of those deals where people are like, well, it seemed like the ducks were late, or it seemed, where were the ducks over here? Or, hey, we just didn't see them in Utah this year. And it's like, if you really think about it from that, you've got one guy sitting in a duck blind, or, and he's looking over one, piece of water or one field, and he's like, the ducks just aren't here. The ducks could be 200 yards the other direction behind a tree line, and he just didn't see them. But, compiling all of that into, just kind of this season review where we're trying to really, there's a lot of speculation, I guess. I think that's one thing for a lot of people to remember, and how it all is pieced together. In, like I said, it's challenging for you guys as waterfowl scientists to look at this, but it's also hard for the average duck owner to look at it. And, maybe early drought in Kansas had an impact on where these birds, like blue-winged teal, as they're, migrating through early. Maybe that had an impact, and those birds shifted a little earlier or a little later, or one way or the other. And so to keep that in mind, as we discuss this, that while the science community is looking at this, the average duck hunter is also trying to peel the layers of the onion out here too. And that's why I think this is important to have this conversation. And Heath, this is kind of a question for you. How do you think that early drought, the low precipitation in Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska was super dry early. Like, how did that, not only was it dry in the prairies, but, through the migration areas, it was also really dry.
You're exactly right. Yeah. So not only did we have drought on major portions of the prairies this year on our production areas, but we had a dry fall and really throughout much of winter, we've remained really dry in many areas where, huge concentrations of, mid-continent mallards and many of our other species spend a great proportion of the winter. So we had, huge areas with very, very little, I won't say no, but almost no water in many shallow wetlands. When we had pushes of birds, we had some cold weather early. You get early migrating pintails in November. Where are they going to go? They're not going to sit on many of our managed units, on national wildlife refuges where they usually would, because they were dry. And it wasn't because we weren't doing our job or didn't care. There was no water. There was no water to lift out of the ditches. There was no water to pull or even pump in some areas. So, even the managed areas, and a lot of us until mid-December or even later, we really struggled to get water on our managed areas. And so these early migrants like pintail, but even the mallards coming in December, they didn't have a lot of real estate to choose from. It's really an interesting problem. Again, not only do we expect different things because of what the changes in the fall flight and adult birds and those kinds of things, but then abnormally dry conditions throughout much of the migration and into early wintering period. So there aren't the traditional places for those birds to stop.
There's so much to unpack here, and it's kind of exciting to think about all the different things that we could get into. But we only have a limited amount of time, right? The fact that we had low precipitation early in the fall, it causes me to think about the conversation we had back in the fall I guess it was back in the fall, maybe right at the beginning of season 5 with our contacts in Arkansas. Austin Booth, director of the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, Luke Naylor, and then Jake Spears, our biologist over there, about the green tree recovery program and plans that they're implementing over there. And one of the big worries was that they had made the decision on some of these WMAs this year, GTRs, to delay flood up. I don't even think they could have flooded up earlier than what they said they were going to if they wanted to. So that's one of those. That's sort of an indication of just how dry it was in some of those landscapes. The mantra that a lot of people were operating under early on when we saw the dry conditions unfolding, it was that, well, if you have water, you should do pretty well with birds early in the season. And I think I think that was probably the case. That's what I heard from various people, is that if they had water, they did well early on, kind of speaking to the limited habitat that was out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was overall, especially right there. I mean, from personal experience in Arkansas, I mean, if you had water early, you typically had ducks, and people did pretty well, myself included. We did very well in Arkansas until we actually got water, until they got water on the landscape, and then our hunting decreased and other people's picked up. But that's kind of the give and take of what it is, and it really happens like that throughout each flyway. We kind of have a tendency here, and I'm to blame for this as well, because we hunt in the Mississippi Flyway primarily, and so we talk about that a lot more. But managing that migration alert program that we have on ducks.org, where I have an opportunity to talk with all of these professional freelance riders who are living in different regions. And so just to throw an example out there of kind of the feast or famine that we all had early, the Pacific Flyway was very much like that as well. I mean, we had podcasts about, drought and severe drought, and then the coin flipped all over there for them, especially in California, Sacramento Valley, and things like that. And so then I talked to the guys after that, and they're like, oh, well, now the hunting's just as hard because now there's too much water. Like, oh, yeah. So, those guys are begging for water, and then they get it, and now they have too much water. But, either one of you, did you guys have any conversations with anyone, even early? I mean, we're still kind of in this early discussion from the Pacific Flyway, where you heard, because I think they got some pretty cold weather, but it was a little bit later than normal to push those birds into like Washington and Idaho and, Oregon. But did you hear any feedback out there?
I spoke with Virginia Getz a few weeks ago. We had an episode with her to kind of put a bow around the California season to get some insights from her, because I had not spoken with very many people out west this year, just the way things fell out. I kept track of your migration alerts and kind of gleaning some information from what they showed. I do recall those early significant rain events. We heard about several atmospheric rivers on the Weather Channel, all these fancy names for these meteorological events. Now, bomb cyclone was, I think, maybe those are one and the same. I'm not sure, but Virginia was talking about that. And you're right, Chris, you referenced the drought also for the western U.S. That was a big topic of conversation, and a very important determinant of that local duck production that occurs throughout those western states, which is an important source of birds for hunters in the West. Depressed production out there last year. Again, I don't know how much data we actually have from any surveys, but I don't think there's any waterfowl biologist that's going to tell you across the western U.S. they had great production. It was just dry. I mean, just near record dry. There was a lot of legitimate worry going into the fall and winter about how much water, how much habitat was going to be able to put on the landscape in some of those key migration areas in the Intermountain West and farther west along the coast. And Virginia, as we were all kind of watching everything unfold, the opening weekend of the duck season there in California, I think Virginia said it was on the second day. I think the first day was no weather event, but the second day is when they got all of that rain, and it fundamentally changed the appearance of the landscape. Most of that, I believe, fell in the Sacramento Valley, some in the San Joaquin, lower in the valley. But yeah, that our greatest worry of almost no habitat being available or greatly reduced habitat being available really didn't materialize the way we thought it would. I mean, they were still constrained on habitat in some areas until they got later in the winter. But I guess they did get some relief early on, and the takeaway that Virginia described was that and I think this is pretty consistent really across the U.S. this year. It felt like an up and down year, like up and down in terms of conditions that we think should be good for waterfowl hunting, for significant migration events. We went through some periods almost on a monthly basis where it looked like it was going to be good. And then it was a complete 180. It got really warm or really stale. And that kind of contrast, you might remember, Chris, with last year where we talked about how it felt stale pretty much the entire hunting season. We just couldn't catch a break. This year was a little different in that we did have a series of ups and downs of favorable and unfavorable conditions, and of course the multiple abundant precipitation events out west, both in California as well as the Pacific Northwest. I know they had several of those atmospheric river events as well that put a lot of water on the landscape, caused some catastrophic flooding in some areas, influenced bird distribution, spread the birds out, made it a bit difficult. Virginia said that her conversation with one of her hunting partners was such that, it feels as though neither the birds nor the habitat nor the hunters ever really found that rhythm, that normal rhythm that we expect from waterfowl for waterfowl hunting in the Central Valley of California. One of your freelance writers in the Pacific Northwest quoted someone of saying something like it just felt weird this year. So that's the only insight that I have, from the Pacific Flyway. I don't know if Heath, if you've spoken with anyone out there, you don't have any, work responsibilities out there, I don't think. But any friend that you might have talked with?
Certainly, and that's consistent with what I've heard as well. Super dry in the late spring and early summer, and we had huge issues getting some of our refuges out there flooded that I know or never got water on some of them, unfortunately, or never significant amount of water because just it was so dry for so long. But then you're right, in some areas it changed, but I haven't heard any. Like, this was a great season. This turned out great for me. I haven't heard very many of those reports from California or other areas, and so I don't really have a whole lot to add to that.
Surprisingly, overall, and not just in the Pacific Flyway, but throughout the country, the hunters that I've talked to and people that I know in different regions, nobody said it was a terrible season, but nobody said it was a great season.
I'll forward you a few emails.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I know. Yeah,
I was going to say, for the record, let me tell you.
It's just people were like, and I think that's very indicative of the habitat too. It was kind of like, it's dry. They got some water, different areas, and so
I also wonder if all of the talk about the drought last year, if that helped to calibrate people's expectations. That's certainly the intent with which we communicate a lot of that because, and especially as I alluded to earlier, the fact that we were going to have a liberal season, the need to kind of calibrate expectations, at least in my mind, I'm sure yours as well, Heath, was really important, because we want hunters to be satisfied. Your satisfaction is the intersection of expectations with experience, as our great friend Larry Reynolds has said before. So
yeah, and with all of this, and I think it's something to keep in mind. There's winners and losers. It was dry in the prairie, so a lot of people who I know who went up there to hunt this year did not do very well. I mean, they did okay.
Tom Mormon and Jerry Holden ended up fishing more than they.
Yeah, and it was warm. I mean, and that was one thing that we really haven't talked about. Is we got cold weather, especially in the central Mississippi flyways, but it was kind of late. I looked back and we did the podcast with
Mike Schumer.
No, Scott Stevens.
Oh,
so we
That's
did
right.
that.
That's right.
Last year. So in 2020, we did that big, the migration alert headline. This is our most popular thing. It's like, Canada's finally freezing. Birds are bailing out of Canada. It's like that's a big deal for our listeners, big deal for our supporters, because that means that's kind of the kickoff of the main migration into the U.S. for mallards and, these hardy birds that finally get chased out of Canada. We did that like October 5th in 2020. In 2021, we didn't do that until November.
Yep.
So that's and it never even dawned on me that happened until I actually looked back at it. And so that's something to keep in mind. I mean, I went to Lake of the Woods, Minnesota on a magazine assignment the first week of October, and we were in flip-flops and shorts walleye fishing. Like, we were up there to duck hunt, and it was like, this didn't work out. We were grouse hunting instead. It just didn't. The ducks weren't there. And so, like I said, winners and losers across the board, but just based on feedback from my freelancers like Jay Anglin, who came on the show several times to provide, he's our Great Lakes migration editor. The guys in Michigan were winners.
Yeah.
From what I've heard.
Yep.
And now, granted, I'll probably get an email now saying, I was not. But, even Jay was like, man, like Harson's Island, these areas, these historical migration corridors,
it was
really held birds.
Harson's Island was not good early because I went to Harson's Island. I was there. We were there in late October, which is normally a good time for a good migration was not the case. It's really interesting to look at some of these maps that we'll put out in the season in review report, because you can dissect some of the things that you're talking about. Departures from average for precipitation, and you look at what these are showing, and it was warm up in the Great Lakes states, warm up in the prairies, and you can see how it changed. But there's also some kind of geographic differences in how those patterns develop, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But your comment about Michigan being a winner, I think that was kind of echoed by a couple of folks that I spoke within DU, saying some of the people that they had talked to had one of their best weekends ever in maybe in December.
Yeah.
Which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, and I got a lot of that feedback. I don't know, Heath, if you were hearing some of the same things, but, of course, I'm the armchair biologist that tries to speculate on when and why and try and explain something, and I have, there's no actual data to back any of it up, but I can do that kind of thing, right, Mike?
Sure.
It's almost like when it was so dry in the prairies, those guys in the Great Lakes states picked up ducks. Even Northwest Ohio, and those Lake Erie marshes, they had fantastic seasons from the guys that I talked to. And it's almost like it was so dry that maybe, some of those birds kind of trickled over to where there was water once the migration really started kicking off. Were you hearing that from some of your Fish and Wildlife counterparts, up in the Great Lakes areas?
Not specifically, but it makes sense. And you think about the way, molt migrations happen too. And that does make sense that, some of the birds that might not have found a good breeding area, or some of the males might have moved to these larger water bodies. Now I don't know about wholesale movements over to the Great Lakes region from the Western Prairies or something like that, but certainly within a region or locally, absolutely, these large water bodies in early fall should have held really large concentrations of birds across most of the mid-continent, because that's where the water was. It was a pretty scarce resource.
Yeah.
There were places in northeastern South Dakota and I think southeastern North Dakota that did pick up a fair bit of rain I don't know when it was, if it was October. I don't remember what month it was, but they picked up a fair bit of rain, actually to the point that portion of those two states is now no longer in drought. So there's a little bright spot up there. But those areas, people that hunted in those areas were beneficiaries of that rain in the context of the lack of water throughout the rest of that landscape. So there's a lot of different scales at which all of these things play out, which determine whether people see birds and whether they're successful hunting. Chris, I don't know, I guess maybe this is a good time to talk about one of the first indications as I mentioned, some of that early water and kind of what was happening as we began to get into the fall hunting season, the teal migration and teal season. That was sort of the first signal that we were looking for in terms of as an index of what happened with production. We spoke with Scott Stevens, and it was hard to get a feel from him up there with regard to the ratio of adults to juveniles. So we didn't have a great I guess a great feel of what was going on other than what we expected to happen. But it felt like as we got into that teal migration, y'all tell me if y'all heard anything similar, it felt like it was early, seemed like it was early, and seemed like it was rather compressed. It was like it was early and then it was over in 3 weeks. Now, that's probably an exaggeration, but I seem to recall Kevin Kreis saying they had one of their best teal seasons ever.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know if what you heard or what anyone has said regarding the age composition of teal or even the sex composition of the teal harvest. That's one thing we talk about often is you can look early on at the composition of, drakes versus hens as an indication of where we are in that migration. Do you recall some of those conversations with Kevin, what he might have been saying?
Yeah, that's interesting. And we touched on that on the last podcast that we did with Kevin regarding the midwinter survey early. And I think I had him on the first week of September. But early, Texas habitat was fantastic. And I think that really helped that teal migrate. There was a lot of kind of rumblings about adult birds, lots of adult birds, and typically as that teal migration progresses from the hunter's perspective, you get those first few shots, they're holding birds, and then, you get that first full moon in September and you pick up more birds and, I think they got a ton of ducks really early. And they held on to them for a long period of time. And they didn't get that, like you mentioned, it was one compressed migration. It wasn't that pulsing, here comes the adult males, here comes
and
the
a compressed
juveniles,
migration would be consistent with low productivity because the females would have finished up they would have either been unsuccessful or they would have been successful early, and then that's it. And so then they would have got on with their wing molt and then been able to migrate south along with the males. That's kind of, in theory, hypothetically, the way it would have unfolded.
Is that kind of the same thing that you guys throughout the Southeast kind of seeing, Heath?
That's consistent with what I've heard. I know some folks in the Missouri Boot Heel did very well. Some folks in Illinois did very well during teal season, but it was a super compressed window. It was 5 days, and if you were there and your habitat was right, even during the dry period, then you could do really well. But then it was over. So that's very consistent with what I've heard from the Mississippi Flyway.
Yeah, I know some guys in Arkansas that actually pumped some fields. And really, they were kind of expecting to hunt that like second weekend, which was normal, and they had already planned to invite their buddies over or whatever. And they walked out one morning and they were holding like 8,000 blue wings. They're like, "Oh my gosh, we got to call everyone to show up early." So that's kind of just what I heard. I think some of the guys down in Louisiana did very well. Those that were not directly impacted by the hurricane. There's a lot of areas down there that were impacted greatly habitat-wise, and they did not do well, obviously. But those who did still have the habitat, they had pretty good blue wing seasons. So that was a good starter for me anyway, to get positive news right out of the gates. Just because I think we went into the season, not us necessarily, but there were a lot of people who, the sky is falling.
Yeah. Your comment there about Louisiana is consistent with what Jason Olzak with Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries told me. We tried to get him on a podcast a few weeks ago, but we failed about 3 times with our technological connectivity because we were working remote, and it just didn't work out. But I did talk with Jason, and he gave me an update on recovery of the marshes from the hurricanes. I guess it would have been in 2020 when southwestern Louisiana was affected by the hurricanes. Those marshes were in really good condition early on.
Yeah.
I think things turned dry as the season progressed. And Heath, you'll be able to provide some insights on some of this here, but as we get into another part of this discussion. But yeah, he said they had good teal season. Teal stuck around pretty much throughout the season. Then some of the precipitation patterns kind of unfolded, and by precipitation patterns, I mean dry. It turned out to be dry in southwest Louisiana. Now, southeastern Louisiana was, of course, affected by hurricanes this past year, and those marshes took a hit. There were birds still there, but next year is the time when I guess now this year, we would really hope those marshes recover. Hurricanes, in some sense, serve as a significant environmental disturbance, setback, succession. They kill a lot of the invasive aquatics. They can, in the year 2 or 3 after a hurricane comes through, can lead to some really good habitat conditions. So anyway, it's good to hear that our Louisiana comrades had some good hunting early on. It got tough later on as things warmed up and dried out. But yeah.
But I think Kevin Cry also spoke to that really fantastic teal season that they had in Texas. Those variables of that hurricane and those habitat impacts in Louisiana very easily, I'm not saying that's why, but very easily could impact. Those birds can shift, and that's one thing that we'll probably get into here in something that we talk about a lot on this show is these distributions, these bird distributions. And you can probably speak to this, Heath, a lot better than I can as far as even the National Wildlife Refuges in the Southeast. These birds are not just going to one refuge and sitting throughout the season, which a lot of, I think,
I don't know. There's some
lazy birds out there.
Well, but new data all the time is challenging the way we think about some of this.
Yeah, but these birds are shifting. That's something for our audience to keep in mind, that a simple rainstorm at Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge outside of Huntsville, Alabama, can impact, these birds in Arkansas. They'll shift pretty quick, not necessarily Wheeler. That's a bad example, but that's something to keep in mind. And do you try to explain it that way to people as well?
We started this off by saying it's super complicated.
I
hate
some
to
people
keep
are going
saying
to get
that.
tired of that explanation at some point, but it's the truth.
It is, because you can't just say ducks do this, ducks do shift. Some species do, and some cohorts of some species do,
and they do at some latitudes, and they may not at some latitudes.
That's exactly right. So there is no question that some big portion of the mallard mid-continent population gets pushed, quote unquote, right, by cold weather and by snow accumulation and a million factors. But there's another portion. They go where they're going to go, and some of them do it fairly early, shockingly early, late October, early November, mid-November. They're sort of where they're going to go until some major change moves them. I mean, you remember that in the Mid-South here, in the Mississippi Flyway, we had huge snowstorm, ice storm, early February last year. I don't know if y'all talked about that on your review last year or not.
I don't know. I think we had already produced that review by then.
Yeah.
Super interesting, though, because I say we, not me, but I'm associated with some projects, right, where several universities are tagging mallards and other dabbling ducks, and we can watch what they do after cold weather events. What was super interesting is we had some record cold temperatures for the Mid-South.
Yeah.
We had snow in Memphis for more than a week. A bunch of us snowboarded. That's ridiculous.
We had some die-offs of birds.
We
in
did.
some locations.
That's
massive ones, really. I mean, not massive, but
but we had die-offs from the cold weather. That's not something we expect these days at this latitude. But you know what? Most of those transmitted birds sat there. They didn't move.
Really?
They sat on the ice. They field fed. They just sort of hung out, or they moved a little bit. So they maybe shifted from northeast Arkansas to central Arkansas. A few went to southern Mississippi, went to central Louisiana, but very few actually made these huge push movements. That just demonstrates their ability to some of these birds to just sit and sort of be fairly robust to some of these cold weather events and really just go to one area. And they don't sit on a sanctuary all winter or, even every day, but they may use a 3, 4, 5, 6 mile area, 90% of the time for a big portion of winter until something changes. But then there are others like Pintail, they don't do that, right? Some of them go to the coast and then they come back in January, late December. Super interesting migration patterns there. They'll shift around the landscape. Teal, who knows what they do? Certainly large movements within winter from what data we have, banding data we have. And so it depends on the species and it depends on the cohort. There's not one mid-continent mallard. There's a bunch of individuals, and they're really hard to predict.
And to add on to your comment about there being a million factors that control these things or influence these things that we're observing, another very important aspect of what you described there in terms of where these birds are moving, how far they're moving, or whether they move could be the time of the year, the time of the fall and winter when that significant cold weather occurs. I know there's sort of a narrative out there right now we hear about and I've seen about and people have asked me about, and I kind of shrug and say, well, that makes sense, but I don't have the data to substantiate it, is that if we would have looked at that same group of birds that you talked about that was transmitted, and if that record cold that we saw in February would have occurred in November, what would the distribution of those birds, the response of those birds have been to that outbreak of cold at that time? We would hypothesize that it would likely be different, right? But we don't know that yet. Maybe we'll get the data and the co-occurrence of that record cold in November, December at some point in time to really measure that.
We will have some information on that from all these studies going on, and not just here. There's studies going on in the Pacific Flyway and huge studies going on in Texas and in the Central Flyway, and so and a huge one now in the Atlantic Flyway too. So we're going to have great information that's going to help us. Get at these factors. And to your point earlier, we did have, it seemed like, some increased variability in the environmental conditions this winter, right? We had some changes in how much water was on the landscape in the migration areas and southern areas. It snowed several times across southern portions of the Central Mississippi Flyway. Not just in February. We got it in December. We got it again in January, and then again in January. So there was some increased variability, and so those researchers will be able to look back and see, to your point, to your question, do they respond differently in December than late January to some of those environmental perturbations?
Yeah, no, that's all interesting, and it'll be fascinating to be able to take that information and then also tie that into kind of the word on the street that I live by. You guys live by the data. I live by the word on the street out here.
Our goal is to have those married.
yeah. But
you can
just
help us, Chris.
like what I'm hearing. These guys who are hunting reelfoot, or maybe hunting northwestern Indiana. And like they're all speculating this and see, we're froze up. The rice fields in Arkansas froze several times this year. And at the same time, I'm talking to my buddies who are hunting like the Wabash River in Indiana, and they're like, "Oh, we're smacking him. Our hunting's the best it's been." And I'm like, and then the average person is trying to put this all together, like, so they're shooting them in Indiana, but my rice field's frozen in Arkansas. And all the birds that we had are gone. They're not going back north, you wouldn't think. But are they going, where are they at now? So it's like that whole speculation that you'll be able to, now with the technology, be able to tie some of that data in and say, this is what these ducks did. Not to say there's what they're going to do next time, because, again, super complicated. But it's all fascinating to talk about.
I feel like your friends on the Wabash River are going to cringe when they hear that, right? Because that's what I heard too, that they did very well this year in that area.
Yeah, they're going to be mad. Really, I take it back. Early on, they struggled. All of them did. Yeah. But as the season progressed, I mean, I've talked about that in my history there in that area. As the season progresses up there, historically, we always kind of joked around the fact that we didn't get ducks there in any significant number until Lake Michigan and the marshes of Lake Michigan got a ton of ice, and that was typically like December 15th. When I was growing up. Now, they got that. First week of January is really when they start picking up, and that's the southern portion of Indiana there, where they had fantastic hunting there at the end. So
maybe we can talk here about the temperature swings that we saw, because there's at least a couple of months that are really significant with regard to, I think, whether people enjoyed or did not enjoy it. And I mentioned that this kind of felt like a roller coaster year. And you look at these, have 5 months here, September through January, and it really was a roller coaster. Yeah. You look at September, and the temperatures were average to a little bit below average pretty much across the U.S. You get into October, it warmed up. It was above average. That speaks to your experience up there at Lake of the Woods, I think you said, where you were in shorts in October. In November, now the western U.S. was still warm, above average in November, but the eastern U.S. was below average, and I remember that. I mean, it was like, okay, we're getting kind of excited. November was when we spoke with Mike Schumer, and we were kind of doing some, maybe it was early November, I guess it may have been late October when we spoke with him, because he was saying, the data are suggesting, the forecasts are looking like we'll have some significant cold outbreaks in November. Those materialized in the eastern U.S., pushed temperatures on average to sort of below average levels, but they stayed warm in the west. But then December happened. December was miserable. December was awful. December might have been the month whenever the western U.S. maybe picked up some, maybe had some of that atmospheric river stuff, maybe a couple of bouts of that. But in the eastern U.S., it was just ridiculously warm. It was one of those, around Christmas, I was in short sleeves, and I may have even been wearing shorts. I didn't hunt very much at all in December because I just didn't want to be out there. But if you look at temperatures on the prairies, they were below average or right at average, starting to dip down there. And then, of course, January happened, and that's when the bottom fell out of the temperature gauge in a lot of places. We saw some prolonged cold spells, which was really exciting from a duck hunter perspective. I think whenever people, and this has kind of been my experience from talking to people, seeing some emails and trying to explain what happened, providing some additional context to that, because you think when we went into January with those multiple cold fronts, and fortunately, I will say that the projections for a warm, an extended warm winter that we heard from Dr. Mike Schumer, and some of the things that, not that he was necessarily forecasting, but some of the people that he follows were forecasting. Back in October, it was looking like, man, it's going to warm up in December and it's going to stay warm through the rest of winter. Fortunately, those people were not right with their forecast, or what they were seeing were incorrect, because it did get cold in January, stayed cold That was exciting, but it took a while for those cold temperatures to influence birds at some of those northern latitudes. I think there was some frustration experienced by that because it was so warm in December. It took several weeks of sustained cold temperatures, and fortunately, we got that to start freezing some of these deeper water bodies up north and start putting ice on some of the deeper water bodies down here even. I mean, I remember it was probably, we had temperatures in the 20s, maybe in the low 20s, and there wasn't a stitch of ice on some of the wetlands that I was hunting in early January just because it was taking so long to cool that water from December back down. Same thing with the Great Lakes. You look at some of the graphs in this report when it comes out, the ice coverage on some of those lakes, they were running way below average through December. Then a few weeks into January with that extended cold, ice coverage really began to spike. So there's a delay. There's a time lag there. And that affects what the birds do and what the habitat does.
Yeah. And even, I kind of keep an eye on snow cover maps.
Yeah.
That they were, there was no snow.
Yeah.
Like South Dakota didn't. I bring John Pullman on the show quite a bit, and he does a great job of providing kind of localized information there in South Dakota, and they just didn't have any snow. I mean, they were pretty warm, through December as well, and then it kind of definitely has gotten colder now, but it was late. That temperature dropout just didn't come until late, and again. There were some winners in that, you know, and I think, some of those guys, even in maybe Wisconsin, Michigan, they really benefited from that warmer weather. Maybe some ducks held up there, some geese, and gave them some additional opportunities.
My experience hunting in Mississippi, I hunted more this year than I have in a long time. I didn't kill a ton of birds. I killed a lot of time, but but it was productive. Because I got to relearn some of the areas that I grew up hunting. I was able to hunt more this year than I had in a long time. And I killed a fair number of birds just because I was out there. I didn't see a lot of birds though, even once we got into January. But now I could tell when new birds had arrived in response to some of that colder weather. There was no doubt that I was seeing some newer birds that had arrived. But I kind of say that just to continually layer on this conversation about what people were seeing. It's fundamentally influenced. Well, I shouldn't say fundamentally. There are several fundamental influences. One of the most important ones is just what does the fall flight look like? So when I was out there and had been out there in like midway through January, multiple weeks of cold temperature, I'm like, man, I wish I ought to be seeing more birds. But then I kind of have to remind myself, well, I don't think there were that many birds in the fall flight to begin with. That's kind of, I had to constantly remind myself of that. And the ones that I saw were adults. Now, they were good-looking adult birds that I was harvesting, but at least the story that I was piecing together in my mind made sense, given what I knew about drought on the prairies and then the way the environmental conditions of the fall and winter were unfolding. Heath, did you get out, hunt much this year?
I did. Unsuccessfully, a whole lot, right? But such is life. But I will say, right at the end of season, similar to last year, a little bit later than last year, but end of the season, it really picked up like it did for a lot of people in the Mississippi in the southern Mississippi Flyway. But to go back to what you just said there, Mike, I thought about this the last day of season. I'm cleaning some ducks, lucky enough to harvest, and I thought, I certainly didn't kill a lot of ducks this season. But I don't think I killed any skinny ducks this season. Great body condition on all of these birds across the many species. I'm not just a mallard hunter. I'll go lay in the rice fields and bean fields and shoot some shoveler and other things. But everything was in really good condition. Mostly adult birds. Only had a few obviously juvenile birds even come through a blind that I was in this year. That I found that abnormal. It was noticeable, and so that's just a small anecdotal snippet, but it does make sense with all of the things that we've talked about. Lots of adult birds in the population, maybe fewer birds too in the fall flight with lower production, and so that there's plenty of resources potentially for those.
I have a tangential question for you here, you as well. I probably killed 15 mallards or something like that throughout the season. at least 2, if not 3, had sarcocystis. And I was with Scott Manley in Arkansas for a hunt. I think we harvested, 8 mallards or something like that. 2 of them had sarcocystis. And I got to thinking, like, I don't know enough about that parasite, what is it? Is it a parasite? To really speak intelligently about this, but it seems, is it possible that it's more prevalent in adult birds? Do we know anything about that?
That's a good question.
It is a good question, and I don't know. I can't put on my disease hat, right? Disease ecologist hat on there right now, but that's an interesting question, and you wonder too about transmissibility and smaller wetlands and more overlap between the species. That's pretty interesting. I may have to go back and think about that.
Yeah, I haven't had much time to look into that, but for next year.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you had such a high number in the percentage of birds that you killed.
And in mallards.
Maybe that explains why I was able to harvest them. Maybe they're the vulnerable birds. They were already
sick.
impaired.
You're preying on the weak, Mike. No, and what's interesting to that is at my place where we hunt in Arkansas, we typically shoot a decent number of birds, and we pretty regularly have, a couple anyway here and there. I didn't see one this year. I didn't see one, and usually
that was my experience too. I don't know that I saw one.
I took care of them for you.
Usually with ours, they're in shovelers.
Yeah.
And I have seen them in mallards over there as well, but usually, maybe it's because you're just not shooting.
Yeah, don't judge.
Don't
judge the quality of the birds that I'm harvesting. Okay, all right. So no,
that's a very interesting observation that.
And I was disappointed. You're so disappointed, whenever you clean the bird, and I was plucking most of these birds, and there may be additional ones in the freezer that I haven't really figured out yet have sarcocystis. But there was one that I had fully plucked it, and I saw something right there. Some of the meat was visible right there at the bottom of the keel, and I pulled it back, and I'm like, son of a gun,
You can still eat it.
I know you can. I know you can. I actually saved some of those, and I'm gonna see what happens. So you and I talked about this. I'm gonna see what happens if I were to prepare it in some type of roast or sort of barbecue, something like that. Because a lot of the fish, bass, redfish, trout that we catch, if you look close, they have various cysts or some kind of worms in them, and ultimately they just kind of get cooked out.
Yeah, no, it's fairly common. But
so topic for a podcast next year.
Absolutely.
Sarcocystis.
No, that's a good one. Well, one thing I wanted, which I found interesting throughout the season, and this is also fairly localized, but Heath, I think this will be a good question for you. That late December, I think it was early January, was when this region, kind of the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, really got dumped on with water. Arkansas was drastic drought. We had Luke Naylor talking about it. It was bad. You guys were exactly the same.
Yep.
When that happens, from your perspective, what are the ducks doing as soon as that water hits? From my kind of what I'm seeing is these birds are just distributing across the landscape. We had great hunting up until that rain. And then they were just gone, everywhere.
The rest of us have a chance, basically. That's what's happening.
Yeah, hey, that's right. But hey, I'll go chase them over there too.
You're exactly right. So, and a couple of things happen. So sometimes we get a lot of water, but we don't get huge temperature changes. We got a lot of water and got huge temperature changes up north and mid-latitude as well. I mean, so we may talk about this in a minute, but, I did aerial surveys from southern Illinois to the Florida Panhandle and over to East Texas, right? And everything in between. And I looked at a lot of ice this year. I mean, even we were dealing in mid-January, we were dealing with, icing on our aircraft on the Louisiana Gulf Coast. I don't know how common that is, but I can't imagine that's something we worry about a ton down there, Mike, is it?
Right? Not that I know. Well, not that I know of, but I have very limited experience doing aerial surveys. I've said on the podcast before, my stomach can't handle it, unfortunately.
And so lots of cold weather layered in with, we're getting a lot of rain locally. We got a lot of rain farther upstream in the watershed. And so Cache River comes up, then the
Yep.
White River comes up, the Ohio's up, the Mississippi's up. And so, we didn't have these massive floods this year, but that right around the 1st of January into about the 10th, 15th of January, that's when all those rivers got out of their banks. And so huge amount of habitat, not to mention all of the rice fields, all of the impoundments that began to catch rainwater too, right? So raining locally as well. Huge change overnight. I know I looked at Luke Naylor's Arkansas report, some great graphics, right, from the Sentinel satellite data in there showing, and it's super obvious. You can see that just in a matter of a couple of weeks, landscape looks completely different.
Yeah.
Tons of habitat out there. And again, at the same time, we've got some of those temperature changes, moving birds around, pushing birds around from the north and around here in the south too. Again, we talk about pintail, and they're waiting on that water in the Arkansas Delta. You get some of that quote unquote reverse migration, but they essentially some of them move back north, and plenty of spots for them then.
Yeah, and I think one really, you bring up pintails in this region too, is there's a field on I-40 as soon as you come out of Memphis. I don't know.
Everybody knows about
People
it. It's
talk
not a
about it. They're like,
secret.
"Oh, let's not talk about that field." Like, there's 100,000 people that drive past that field every day. Everyone sees these pintails. I mean, there's literally
like 40
thousands.
yards off the road.
I mean, I
40
don't
yards
even
there.
know how to describe the number. I mean, I'd hate to put an actual number, but thousands,
It's
potentially
tens of thousands.
Tens of
absolutely.
I didn't want to jump the gun there because
no,
there's a million.
When there's water out there, that's a great barometer for everyone coming from Memphis over into Arkansas to hunt, right?
What kind of field is it? Is it
rice and bean typically
is it
rotation.
unhunted? They don't hunt it?
No one hunts it.
Okay.
As far as I know. I know some people are trying to hunt it. But that would ruin the whole thing because but it's really cool because those birds come and go a lot. And it's not even, you kick a big north wind up and those birds will disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And guys are like, "Oh, those things are gone. They moved on." Like, they're not. They don't really. We don't really know where they're exactly going. You may have a better idea of this, but and then they'll come back, and you can drive by there, and you can see those pintails have that rust color on their chest. Those birds were on the Gulf Coast, and it's like, and I think it's a good opportunity for me to explain to people that regional distribution and how easily these birds, they could go jump the river and go into Tunica. I mean, they can see Tunica practically where they're at, or they could hop and go to the coast, and that's a not even a day flight. I mean, they may be going down there to feed and then come back to this field because nobody's hunting and it's safe, and it's like it's such a cool barometer for the kind of the pintail in the alluvial valley right there. And I'd hate to see if somebody actually hunted it because then they'd probably just move to another field that no one's hunting.
They'd get a few good hunts, but then it's no longer going to serve as their safe space.
Yeah, but it's cool that you notice that as well.
Yeah, so me along with the 8 other million people, right, who drive
exactly,
who drive over to Arkansas to hunt several times a week. But did you notice this year? Very little water, and not just in that field, but there are several of those sort of barometer, if you will, fields around.
Yeah,
very, very little water this year. Seemingly, my anecdotal observation is a lot fewer pintail, especially east of Crowley's Ridge this year. Just that we didn't. I mean, we got some later when we got some water, but my observation was not as many pintail, and I can tell you that I saw them at other places during the aerial survey this year.
Yeah, and the interesting thing on the pintails there, and this is, I hate to always keep on focusing on this Mississippi, flyway, but it's what we're in and we talk about a lot. But like Jay Anglin up in Indiana, they're talking about unprecedented numbers of pintails in central Indiana in January. I mean, he's calling me like these guys are decoying 1,000 at a time, and then they're shooting their pintail, and then they're just watching them. And it's like, these guys have never had this opportunity with pintails.
They've never experienced that frustration.
Yeah, in like central and southern Indiana. And I even spoke with Adam Phelps about this. And he's like, I'm hearing reports of massive numbers of pintails. Well, that's interesting too, because the hop from, here to the coast is probably the same as from here to, central Indiana. It's like, that's almost the same. So like, when those birds disappear, you can hear, like, oh man, like somebody down in Mississippi had a great hunt on pintails.
And there's probably other examples of that type of situation all across the landscape. I think I remember maybe in Houston Haven's report for Mississippi, they reported a unusually large number of pintails in the North Delta. I think I'm remembering that correct. I know Mallory Murphy here, who lives there in the Mississippi Delta, was just kind of sharing observations of we have a lot of pintails. There was a certain week where she noted a lot of pintails in their particular area.
Southern Arkansas had a lot of pintails. Now, it was something I noticed during my surveys this year, and anecdotally hearing reports from Southern Arkansas where I don't consider that to be just a huge area where lots sit. Maybe it is, and I just gave away a secret, right? But they had secrets. That's right. That's all we're doing.
If you give away all of them, then everybody loses and everybody
That's
wins.
right.
It all balances out. At some point, we've referenced it a couple of times. The aerial surveys that you flew would now be
I think
a good
I
time
was
to talk
just
about that.
going to say that.
I want to talk about the Atlantic Flyway a little bit to the extent that we understand it. And you actually flew some surveys over there in that part of the world, so maybe that'll give a transition there as well. But one of the reasons why, there's several reasons why you were a great addition to this season in review episode. You're local. You're a PhD level waterfowl ecologist that covers the entire southeastern U.S. You're a good friend, and you've been on the podcast before. So you're racking up all these reasons why you're going to continue to come back.
He's telling people about the pintail field.
That's right.
That's right.
I'm blaming it on him.
But also, you flew most of the month of January all across the southeastern U.S. Doing waterfowl surveys on national wildlife refuges, right? Tell us about that.
That's correct. More than I had anticipated when I set that up. So just to step back a little bit. So many states, especially in the Mississippi Flyway, Southern Central Flyway, and perhaps out west as well. I'm less familiar with that. They do a midwinter waterfowl survey. Aerial surveys are by far the most efficient and effective way to estimate numbers of birds in an area, such as the Arkansas Delta or the Arkansas River Valley or the Delta of Mississippi or Louisiana Gulf Coast, so on and so forth. So many state agencies coordinate and run their own midwinter survey at the state level or major portions of the state that are sort of considered waterfowl habitat, right? So Houston Havens is in charge, and Mississippi in their Delta region of, they do line transect surveys and get an estimate of the total number of birds there. Simultaneously, at the same time, during that first week of January, Luke Naylor's coordinating that with a bunch of his biologists and managers in Arkansas, and Jason Olzak is doing that in Louisiana, and so on and so forth. And so they're covering these large areas, and they talk, but they're kind of independent surveys. So at the same time, we on Refuges, it's not that we're not interested in what's going on in the state, but they're already covering that. But we have objectives for the number of birds that we think we need to provide resources for at those local refuge levels. And so we need to fly a survey of just our refuges. And we actually use a similar design. It's a probability-based transect sampling design, but it's at a much smaller scale. And so there's some different tweaks that we do because we're not surveying, 400 square miles or 1,000 square miles. We're surveying, 10,000 acres, 2,000 acres, 20,000 acres, something like that, with a few exceptions like Cache River Refuge and White River and Cameron Prairie and Sabine on the Gulf Coast, some of those. So what we do is we develop a survey design, or I develop a survey design, and then we have biologists from the Fish and Wildlife Service who are trained in aerial survey estimation and design, and they go and they fly this design. We have some areas that we do what are sort of considered a census-style survey. So if you have a group of impoundments, we're going to go do a total estimate of birds on that impoundment. And then we have large reservoirs or tracts of bottomland, hardwood trees, something like that. We're going to do a line transect sampling. So all fancy way of saying we've got to do some math. Heath has got to transcribe all the data, throw it into a model, do some corrections, and boom, we come up with an estimate of the number of birds that are using Reelfoot National Wildlife Refuge, Sabine National Wildlife Refuge, so on and so forth.
At a point in time.
Again, it's a single point in time. And we are doing it at the same time as the states are doing this larger scale survey. So, so for instance, if we were to talk to Luke or to Houston, they may say, well, our area of this area of the state, the strata, may have 200,000 ducks. And I can say, that's awesome. We also did an estimate on Bald Knob National Wildlife Refuge, and it had 50,000 ducks. And I'm just making up those numbers, right?
And that was going to be a question that I asked. Do those transects interlap? Like, are you guys?
They do.
Like, so Luke's survey would go over the Cache River as well, and then you guys are coming in and kind of do it, and then you guys compare those numbers, or is that
we can absolutely?
Okay,
So
yeah,
it's
cool.
it's good to coordinate,
Yeah,
right? You don't want to
absolutely.
fly at the same place on the same day at the same time, right?
Yeah.
That's not a good idea.
You guys don't pass each other.
That's right. We don't want to wave.
Yeah.
We don't want to wave each
Say,
other.
don't
out
worry
of the
about that.
airplane.
I've already counted it. You don't do that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of coordination, right? So
Yep.
we flew 7 or 8 different states, I believe, this winter. We had 4 aircraft were involved, 4 pilots, about 4 different observers that were going with each one of those, and so it's a lot of coordination. Plus, we've got Luke for Arkansas has a bunch of different people flying, and so different states have different numbers of aircraft. So yes, we're coordinating. So they are flying over for the most part our national wildlife refuges. Although it's just one portion of their huge transect that's going over, many miles. Some of their transects may be 20 miles, 100 miles, maybe. They're large transects where we are, some of ours may be 1 mile or half mile or something like that, because we're just trying to get an estimate on our little piece of the pie, right?
Now, do you guys do Missouri? Because I know Missouri does the
They do.
public areas. Did you guys do?
We did not fly any of any Missouri this year. We did, so that's
They
Fish and
kind of
Wildlife's-
handle that, right?
So the state handles that,
Yeah.
and they did fly some of their areas. We did fly into Illinois a little bit, for some of that coverage, and coordinated with the DNR in Illinois. But no, we didn't fly any of the Missouri refuges. I work for Legacy Region 4, the Southeast region, but we'll assist with adjacent
You
things.
dabble in
And
Illinois.
dabble in the
Dabble
other
in
regions
Illinois.
as needed.
Yeah.
As needed and requested.
As requested.
Now, those surveys, Heath, the states that you're conducting the refuge surveys in do their own midwinter survey that you talked about. They use different designs. For example, in Tennessee, I think the state probably uses a series of cruise surveys across their WMAs. They do not survey, nor do they extrapolate to any of the areas that you would be surveying, right?
That's correct.
So in that state, you could take the numbers developed from TWRA surveys and from yours, add them together to kind of get a more complete picture of the number of birds wintering at a given time, right?
In fact, that's exactly what we do. So every state is a little bit different, and so we work with the states. In some cases, they use our data. We add it together, and that becomes essentially an index that's consistent over time. Other states are doing an estimate. They're extrapolating over the entire area of the state, and they don't use our data because they fly over our refuges. No, they don't produce an estimate for our refuges because their design is not appropriate to do it at that scale, which is why we have to come back and fly it ahead of time, right?
Yeah. So I just wanted to provide that bit of maybe sort of a statistical clarity. You might say that detail is that these numbers aren't necessarily completely additive to what would be estimated in a given state. It's going to depend on the survey design that those states use.
Yeah.
So takeaway observations from your time in the air and what you heard from other people?
Gosh, incredibly variable, right? I hate to say it's complicated, but gosh, it's complicated. Lots of ice in the northern portion. Oh, you know what? I should back up and say when we flew, because I'm just assuming that people know when the midwinter survey is. So the midwinter survey traditionally is that first full week of January. So this year, I think that began January 2nd or 3rd, something like that. Was that Monday, right? And so and then went until about the 10th. So that's when all of the states are flying. That's when, if a state needs our data, that's when we're going to try to fly as well. The thought behind that is that you don't want to double count birds. So you don't want to, birds can move, obviously. You get cold weather events, so not everyone can fly on the same day or the same time of day. But within a week, you probably limit the amount of double counting, because you limit the amount of chance that the birds would do these large scale movements and go from state to state, area to area. We don't have quite that same restriction with our refuge surveys, because we have our own population objectives that we're trying to gauge our performance to meeting those population objectives and make sure we provide the amount of food that those ducks and geese require. And so we survey certainly during that same time period, but we can go further into January, and it's not a big deal for us. So that's our time period. We just want to be there when there are a lot of birds there, sort of during that peakish time, but we don't have to hit the peak. It's not necessary for our survey design, if that makes sense.
And one question, all of these states, I'm looking at the midwinter survey information here, and all of these states, you can anyone that's listening can go to these state agencies and find this data.
Yes.
In some cases,
most states.
it's harder to find for some states than others.
Right.
At this time, because I've been trying to do that.
Yeah, but is that the same with the refuge surveys? Do you guys have somewhere that you post that publicly that someone can look at it and just for their information, really?
Yes, but it takes longer because I'm an army of one going through the information, and that's my excuse, and I'll stick to it, right? But yes, eventually we have a waterfowl working group page. Mm-hmm. So if you Google Fish and Wildlife Service waterfowl working group, you can get right to it. Yeah, use your whatever search engine and get there.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure that if that's possible, people can look at it, but.
And the other resource that's out there that will become available eventually is something called the Flyweight data books. It's something that's produced. It's a collaborative effort between the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's available on the Fish and Wildlife Service pages, where it has people that are into waterfowl and waterfowl data will get drunk off of these books, because there's every piece of waterfowl data that you can imagine is going to be in some of these. They're usually produced for each flyway. And so what happens in those is they will take the information that Heath was just talking about, that I was just kind of describing, where for some states you combine the state surveys with the federal surveys to get the, quote, state estimate, but in others it's just the state estimate. That's where people can access all of that information in a single place. Those don't come out until later in the year, because there'll be harvest estimates, there will be hunter estimates, there will be all these midwinter estimates. So that's another resource that's out there for people.
Yep. And we try to be as interactive on social media as we can be. And so many of our individual refuges have social media accounts. We have a regional, waterfowl working group social media account. And so sometimes, 2 hours after I flew over a place, I would, if I had the time and in the aircraft, snap a quick picture with my phone, and I'll say, hey, lots of birds here, or saw something interesting in the marsh here, and then oftentimes hunters would ask questions, what did you see? And to the extent that I have the time and it's appropriate to answer, I'm not going to answer anything about anybody's single duck blind or whatever, and I'm not looking at that either. I don't have the time to. Things are happening fast at more than 100 miles an hour, flying over, but I'm interacting with people on social media, and many of our stations are too, and so that's an excellent way to get those survey numbers, or to say, there was a big pile of mallards here, or hey, wow, great numbers of green-winged teal I didn't expect over here, and I'll throw that out during our surveys in early January.
Yeah. Do you guys want to go through like the state?
Well, just take home. I don't think we ever got to a big take home.
Yeah, so
and then we'll highlight some of the midwinters, and then we'll start to wrap this up.
Yeah. Couple of pretty interesting things. And so during early January, I saw a lot of ice, right? And one of the other big things is I never saw huge piles of birds, if you will, right? Which usually, and not that I'm advocating for that or not advocating for that, I usually just see that. It just happens that you'll go to somewhere like Bald Knob National Wildlife Refuge in Arkansas and see 150,000, ducks and geese sitting there.
You can like text me that. No, I'm just kidding.
No, there's an embargo on that.
That's right. There's a delay. In 2020, we had that. We had 150,000 birds there. We had 160-something thousand birds, I recall, at White River. But the water was up a little. Bit this year at White River. I don't know, 10 to 20,000 birds. Completely different. But only 25% of the woods probably was flooded, especially that south area, which is the sanctuary unit, White River. Not a ton of water in there. Cache River had some birds in some areas like the Plunkett Farm, but Dixie, our big refuge tract, it didn't have that many birds on it this year, and there was a lot of ice where there was, and so we didn't have huge pockets of birds like I expect to see. Everyone, or most people, had a few. There were lots of 20,000 here, 10,000 here. Reelfoot had 60,000. Big Lake Big Lake had a lot of bird. Heads up, everybody. Like Big Lake had a lot. Yeah, Big Lake had a lot of birds this year. That was pretty interesting, and it surprised me a little bit. A lot of birds, maybe 50 or 60,000 this year. So that's a lot of birds for a little bitty, relatively really small national wildlife refuge with where our management capabilities are kind of limited. One of the units of Cameron Prairie down on the Gulf Coast. Lots of birds, just absolutely loaded up. But right across the lake at Sabine, way fewer birds than what I expected, and probably some of that was marsh conditions. You could tell where the surge had pushed through, and the salvinia was it seemed like it was gone. Then you'd come to another area where, boy, there's just massive piles of salvinia everywhere. Probably hasn't had I think that's how that works, right? You get the surge and pushes out the salvinia. Is that right, Mike?
Well, the salvinia will die as a result of the salt water elevated salinity there. It can't tolerate that. I'm not sure if you were seeing. There will be rack lines. Rack line that includes salvinia. It includes scoured vegetation of whatever type is there, and in some cases, it can kill the underlying marsh and take some time for that marsh to recover. But it just pushes up whatever kind of vegetation is there. Fortunately, it kills a lot of that invasive aquatic stuff because it can't really tolerate the salinity.
Yeah. So to a point earlier, super interesting, the sort of anecdotal stuff you can see from those hurricanes in 2020 and 2021. Still a lot of debris out in the marsh. Pickup trucks and shipping containers and porta-johns. That was something interesting that I didn't expect out of the marsh, but for whatever reason, lots of those out.
The wind can catch those pretty easy.
Apparently, they fly well and wash around well. So that's super interesting. My biggest takeaways from doing those, no big pile of birds, any single place. Lots of smaller birds distributed across the landscape, which is probably reasonable and probably good. Most hunters who find one of these sanctuaries and hunt around them, there are some birds nearby them, right? So it's acting like we want it to.
Y'all haven't been doing these surveys like this for very long, right?
2 years, and so this was year 4 of the design because of COVID restrictions and the government shutdown and stuff. This is actually the second year, but we hope to have these. Hope to have these going, for the into the future. They're important for us from a policy standpoint and from a management standpoint to see where we are and give us feedback on the management that we're doing on national wildlife refuges.
I imagine it's also you're viewing it as a valuable communication tool or piece of information, because it speaks to, as I'm hearing you talk about the number of birds that you're seeing at this location, the number of birds that you're seeing at this location, and all across the refuges in the southeastern U.S. And you can even back up and talk about it across the entire U.S. and Canada. When we do talk about the type of protected areas they have, we can throw the states into this conversation as well. Each of these managed areas, whether they're sanctuary, whether they're intensively managed or not, they provide this entire network of valuable habitat across the landscape that helps to support these birds where they are. It helps to probably spread the birds out a little bit. And I know it's easy for people to get frustrated at seeing 10,000 pintails or 10,000 ducks or geese of whatever kind behind a sanctuary sign. But if that sanctuary weren't there, I know, because I can tell you that I grew up in a place where there's a federal sanctuary, Corps of Engineers sanctuary. Some years it's flooded, some years it has water in it, some years it doesn't. When it doesn't, there are not very many birds around. And so if these sanctuaries across the landscape were not there, then you're going to see a reduction in the number of birds that are going to be in that general area. So I would imagine that y'all are kind of thinking about it from that perspective as well, being able to tell the story about the role that the refuge plays in supporting landscape-level waterfowl populations.
Absolutely, it gives us more information to communicate about, and we can speak intelligently when somebody asks us a question about, well, hey, ask us a legitimate question. Are you guys, holding all of the birds? Well, no. We had on refuges, in 2020 in Arkansas, several 100,000, but the Game and Fish said there were a million there, or more than 1.5 million birds there.
Yeah.
Well, then 80% of them are somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right? They're on state areas, they're on private areas, and so that gives us the data then to know that, and that's what we want. We want them spread across the landscape with lots of people enjoying those birds. It's exactly what we want.
Anything else, or have we covered anything notable from the Atlantic Flyway? Kind of as we touch on that a little bit.
That's a good question. So I didn't do the surveys in North and South Carolina, but we did have surveys that happened in North and South Carolina with Brian Van Druten, one of our refuge staff, doing those surveys. I heard from him earlier. It's just some anecdotal observations. He said overall numbers were lower than what he expected in North Carolina and South Carolina, especially at Mattamuskeet. He did note that there were high numbers of black ducks at Pea Island National Wildlife Refuge. That's pretty neat. Pea Island's a really neat little wildlife refuge. It gets this huge diversity of birds that, if people haven't been there in North Carolina, it's a great place, and you can see the birds that are there. So lots of black ducks was sort of his report from there. I did do the survey at St. Mark's in the Florida Panhandle. What a neat refuge. I've never flown that refuge before. It hasn't been flown in a few years with one of our surveys. Lots more birds there than I expected.
Those are like redheads and scaup, and
I feel like you couldn't, like every bufflehead in the Atlantic Flyway, right? Must have been there. I mean, I don't know how many buffleheads there are, but like they had to all be there. I mean, tens of thousands of buffleheads. Pretty neat. But yes, redheads and scaup. There was a flamingo hanging out in the impoundments. I had to get on eBird to convince myself that was that I had seen that, right? Because
cool.
That was like, wow, that's not a spoonbill, right?
Yeah.
Exactly right. So that was pretty neat. But yeah, lots of birds there for those folks in the Florida Panhandle. In Southeast Louisiana, didn't have huge numbers. Delta Marsh had some. National Wildlife Refuge had some birds, and then it was Southwest was spotty. Like I said, Sabine, not huge numbers there. Lacassine and Cameron Prairie had good numbers. There were lots of mallards. Had lots of mallards. Unexpected number of mallards at Lacassine, which is good. So
I think that lines
neat.
up with a lot of the even the migration alerts and just hearing from hunters. North Carolina hunters were pretty bummed out this year. I got a lot of calls, a lot of discussions. They just didn't. They really didn't have the weather, and then they didn't have the ducks, and it just people were frustrated there, and I can understand that. And it sounds like they just didn't have the overall numbers and I think they were dry, and then they got water, and it just didn't work out for them. But go ahead.
I've seen some I guess information from South Carolina from a friend of ours, Molly Neese, saying that what she was experiencing and what she was telling people. She's like, is she the state waterfowl biologist there for South Carolina? She was telling people that it got cold, but December was so warm for us, it took a long time. What I was talking about earlier, there's that lag between when it really got cold and when it started to put ice across all of those important areas up north that really need to freeze up in order for them to see, big movements of birds. A lot of the birds in the Atlantic Flyway, of course, are going to come from the eastern boreal forest. They'll get some from the prairies. And so they obviously took a little bit of a hit there with the drought and low productivity for anything coming out of the prairies. But it's tough sledding there in the Atlantic Flyway due to some of the same environmental conditions that we talked about, and you might have had some success late as a result of that extended cold weather. But it was an interesting year, ups and downs, and thankfully we had January to salvage the season. Man, I hate to think what it would have been like. Hate to think for me, and I think for a lot of other people in certain parts of the Southeast, I hate to think what it would have been like if we didn't have wood ducks. Wood ducks saved my season, had great production for wood ducks in the areas where I hunted. It stayed wet throughout the summer. Good brood rearing habitat there. And if we didn't get that extended cold weather in January, it would have been an entirely different conversation right now. It wasn't a gangbuster year by any stretch of the imagination, but I think people's expectations were calibrated reasonably, given the drought, low productivity, and then finally we got some cold weather to help move birds around. That is the thing that we would say with regard to the midwinter numbers. This is where we can transition there, I guess, briefly. They do bear out for some of those states that conduct surveys monthly. there are a few of them here at southern latitudes and mid latitudes that conduct these surveys on a monthly basis. And you can see how their numbers change from December to January. And birds did move in response to that cold weather. And they moved sometime between early December, mid-December, and when they conducted those surveys the first week of January. I would like to think, and it probably was, pretty soon after that real strong cold outbreak at the first of the year.
Yeah.
Kevin Cry talked about it. Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, their counts in Louisiana, or their counts in January were all significantly up from their December counts. They were still below average. That's the take home across all of these midwinter survey numbers. Snapshot in time, all the important caveats there. No state of the ones that we've amassed or that we've compiled here thus far stand out. Most of them, though, you're looking at below average counts.
Yeah.
That would be expected. That would be consistent with a small fall flight. The fact that numbers changed between December and January says birds moved, but still the numbers were down on average. There were a couple of notable numbers here. Kansas, Tom's doing something right out there. Their numbers were up at the midwinter. Now, we can't speak to what the numbers were like before or after that. Again, kind of put that caveat. But they had good numbers of birds there in Kansas. Their total duck number was significantly up from the 10-year average. Their mallard count was almost double their 10-year average, coming in at around 590,000 mallards across their survey area.
That's interesting, to see, after talking with Kevin about, and he was very open about the fact that he thought that their midwinter survey was going to be like the lowest on record. Like he was like, we don't have any ducks. And then we got that cold front. They did the survey just after that, and it was 8% down, but really that's not, that indicative of, I guess that's not a huge number to be down. I mean, they had tons of birds. But Kansas, kind of to look at it and think, well, if Texas was up right then, Kansas was up, like where were all these birds, 2 weeks prior? That's just my head thinking, like, they could have done Kansas, maybe 3 days earlier, and it would have been down 80%.
They may have. Yeah, you'd have to kind of really piece together those because of what we were talking about, a snapshot in time. And these birds move. When birds get up and move, they get up and move in a matter of hours and overnight. So, yeah. And, there's a lot of other things that we could talk about here. We're probably not going to be able to in detail, but dryness in Oklahoma. It was really dry there, and it was probably dry in Kansas as well. It was dry in Texas. We've had Kevin Cry talk about that.
Yeah, like the Oaks and Prairies regions of Texas, they were significantly down in numbers. And if you look at a map, that Kansas area, that's not a far hop, especially because Kansas got water. They were really dry, and then they got water, and it's like that kind of makes sense.
And northeastern Oklahoma had some water during middle of the season as well that the central and western part of the state didn't have. It's pretty interesting when you zoom in.
If we look at North and South Dakota in contrast to last year at the midwinter, those two states still were holding a fair number of birds. Kind of to do a contrast here, I think last year was a record late date for one of their big lakes to freeze over. That lake froze over much earlier this year. They didn't have very many mallards. As Rocco Murano, whenever he sent me the numbers, he said, see, we didn't have all the mallards this year, I promise you. Now, the mallard numbers were really low in North Dakota and South Dakota. What do I have here? South Dakota, their mallard number was down 85% from the 10-year average. North Dakota down 72% from the 10-year average. And so, it begins to piece together kind of nicely at a big landscape scale. There's nothing that's like total head scratcher on what we're seeing here.
No, that's right. I mean, we joked about the Wabash region earlier of Indiana and Illinois, but all in all, from all the data that we can look at and piece together, there aren't huge piles of birds sitting at northern latitudes, this year.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a few thousand here, Grand Pass in Missouri's going to have some birds.
Illinois
right?
Illinois River Valley had a ton of birds, but it kind of shifted. It went back and forth. It was interesting.
It did, and the midwinter survey there was down. I don't recall what it was, but 70 or 80% below average or something. I mean, there were very few birds left in the Illinois River Valley, but over in the Wabash region now there were some there when you get south and you get east. So from all I can tell, all my flying, all the ice I saw being in southern Illinois, there weren't huge numbers of birds sitting somewhere else. They're just spread out along what we had this year was just spread out, on the landscape. There were a bunch at Wheeler, and there were a bunch in West Tennessee, and there were a bunch over here, just not the huge piles in any one area that we've seen in the past, I think.
Yeah. And I think all of these numbers, it's just funny how much it does kind of reflect even just the anecdotal information that you can pick up from hunters. I mean, the Texas guys that I know did really well early, did really well late, kind of had a lull in the middle, which makes perfect sense. Looking at how the data came together. Arkansas overall, I mean, like I said, I've talked to people and they're all like, it's better than what I thought.
Yeah.
People were going into it really bummed out, and they felt like they had most people, felt like they had a pretty good. Obviously, there's winners and losers all across the board.
There will be exceptions. If you're one of the people listening to this that had an absolute miserable season where nothing that we're talking about aligns, well, that doesn't surprise me.
And I understand.
There's lots of people out there.
That is the case and will be the case every single year.
And what's interesting here and just jumps off the page at me is that Nebraska had one of the lowest mallard numbers in 20 years on their midwinter survey. And I think, the past 5 or 6 years, as a lot of people have talked, we've been so warm. And my excuse,
they were in Kansas.
Yeah, no. Well, my excuse,
they moved out of Nebraska,
and I've said
into
this
Kansas.
on the podcast before when people are like, "Where are the ducks?" I'm like, "Man, it's 65 degrees in Nebraska in January." Well, it wasn't 65 degrees in Nebraska when they did this survey. I guarantee it.
And so that is seriously one of those situations where if you want to say, "Well, why did Nebraska not have any birds but Kansas did?" You would really want to look at the actual dates of when they flew those surveys, and that. It's entirely feasible. I don't know this to be true by any stretch of the imagination, but it could entirely be that if they would have flown that survey a week prior in Nebraska, maybe they would have seen twice or 4 times the number of birds. Who knows?
Yeah.
We don't have that information.
And just some other cool information that you pulled together here. The light goose number in Kansas.
Yeah,
it's
awesome.
a
second year in a row they've had a really high light goose number. Those birds are moving around.
Yeah, and Arkansas is down like 20-25%, and that's
That's an interesting story that's unfolding, in terms of what those birds are doing and how they're responding to hunting pressure and how they responded to the traditional hunting pressure on the Gulf Coast of Texas. And these birds are amazing. Frustrating, they're amazing.
Yeah, and I think, one thing, and I'm just going to kind of toot my own horn here and throw a little plug in for our March-April issue of the magazine, which will be coming out very soon. I did a feature on, white front distribution, but really it's kind of a spec destination piece. But, our listeners will be able to look at that. And this kind of indicates some of this stuff. Like one of the new hot spots for white fronts is Kansas, central Kansas. And I worked with Tom on that and, really kind of explaining these birds are showing up here in large numbers. And this survey absolutely validates that. So
now you're going to get hate mail from all the hunters in Kansas.
That's all right.
You get it anyway.
I already get hate mail from Kansas. So, this has been great. I think, what we are doing with this podcast is really laying the groundwork for a document that Mike is working on, the season in review document. This will be a great place. It's kind of just to throw the promo out there for people to be prepared, get ready for that. You're going to see it. You're going to see it on ducks.org. People will be sharing it around. You'll probably receive it by email.
We'll post it online on social media, hopefully circulate that widely. And I don't know what kind of delivery date we're going to have on that. Like I said, one of the things that I have to wait on is the final midwinter survey numbers because of some of the different ways that the number
You're pointing at me, Mike.
I was pointing at Heath. I'm not saying Heath is the cause for the holdup, but because of the way the numbers have to be summarized in some of the states, it takes pretty much to the end of February before those numbers are available.
And I always like to remind our audience of this. You know, we just did this long podcast and we talked about a lot.
Yeah, it was fun.
And there's a lot for people to kind of digest here. But if anyone has any questions about anything that any of us said, you can always email dupodcast@ducks.org. We have that email address available. And I think we need to probably push that a little harder just to get people, you know, to really, if you do have a question, don't stew on it. Don't be mad. Go ahead and send us an email and we'll have Mike answer it.
It can be, or I'll bring Heath in to answer it. We have the whole Fact or Fiction series that we're doing now. We can do a dedicated episode to a certain topic, any of that type of stuff. The one thing we didn't get to, and I'm not going to take us there right now, but I'll just kind of tease some forthcoming episodes, is how the spring and summer season is shaping up. There's a number of things to talk about there. The one sentence summary is that in the important breeding areas that were in drought last year, we got some relief. We're talking about the western U.S. or the prairies. We got some relief, but we're still in drought situations in much of that area. We need more precipitation in the form of snow and or rain over the next few months. We'll be connecting with a lot of people as we go forward to give updates on that. And then also, we're very hopeful, fingers crossed, that we're going to have a waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey across all of the important breeding areas to talk about. Things are looking good. That's about all we can say right now. The plans are moving forward to have that survey conducted. Let's just hope something doesn't fall loose and, you know, basically, let's hope we don't have another COVID surge, if I'm going to be blunt. That's what would derail it again, if we had another COVID surge.
Cool. I think that's exciting. I think it's something exciting for people to look forward to.
Right now, there's reason to be optimistic.
Awesome. That's great. Well, Heath, thank you for joining us today.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Mike, thank you for
great to be
adding
here.
your insight. I'd like to thank my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher, everyone's favorite DU waterfowl scientist, for joining us today. I'd like to thank Dr. Heath Hagy from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for coming here today in studio and really digging into some of the numbers. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.